Shabbat Shalom. Let's learn this week's Parsha with Rashi's commentary. We're in the book of Leviticus, Sefer Vayikra, chapter 11. And let's look a little bit more closely at two verses that come at the end of this week's Torah portion, 44 and 45 of chapter 11. There's a key word in verse 44 that is about Jewish mindsets, Jewish hearts, the way a Jew approaches life, and all that is permissible for a Jewish soul and a Jewish person to eat or engage in the world. And in verse 45, there's a special verb that comes, and it's used here and only here to describe God's bringing us out of the land of Egypt, except it's not the typical verb that we might expect. And Rashi is going to teach us about that unique choice of language that we see here in the Torah. So, verse 44 first. Ki ani Adonai Elohechem, because I am the Lord your God. This is coming at the end of lists of all kinds of animals that are permissible to the Jewish people. It's the menu for keeping kosher. And God says after these descriptions of the animals that are permissible versus those that are impure, here, let me tell you the reason why, because I am the Lord your God. Now, it could just stop there. But God grants us the opportunity to make our lives holy. It's not just that choosing to keep kosher or choosing the right animal to eat makes you kosher. That it could have just said, V'hiyitem kedoshim. The verse includes a hitpael verb, a reflexive verb, that recognizes that, yes, it's God's commandment, a mitzvah, a commandment, to eat the kosher animal and reject the treif and the impure. But it's a matter of free will. It's a matter of one's own choosing to pursue a life of holiness. And this key word, this key verb, it comes here in chapter 11 because it applies to every individual human being, every individual Jew. Each of us has to dive into what we want to eat. No other person can eat for you. A shaliach to go eat dinner, you cannot appoint. You'll have to nourish yourself. You'll have to sit down and eat a meal. And you'll have to make the choice as to what you eat. And this reflects a verb, v'hit kadishtem. And you shall choose to sanctify yourselves through these mitzvot that I gave you. I recognize you have free choice in the matter. And then, v'hitem kedoshim. And then you shall be holy. Ki kadosh ani. Because I am holy. God says, I created all this bountiful world of possibility for you. And sometimes, yes, I have to even put boundaries and borders on things. The sea has to stop and the land has to start. There are boundaries and borders. And with all of the variety of animals that are out there, there's going to be boundaries, borders. Put up fences. You can become pure and holy through the dietary choices you make. And it's through your own free will that you will find the capacity to engage this system of kosher, to make the choice about eating the pure animals and rejecting the impure. And then you will sense the power in that choice and become holy like I'm holy, God says. Torah many times will tell us in other places, Kedoshim to you, you shall be holy. Puts out lists of mitzvot. Doesn't necessarily use this verb, kadishtem, but that's a key verb to remember. It came before this description that we would be a holy people because it recognizes the internal free will choice that we make to engage in eating what's pure, doing the mitzvot that God outlines in passages of the Torah. So God says it plainly here about kashrut. Lo titamu et nafshotechem b'chol hasheretz haromes al haaretz. And as a great example of what not to eat, anything that's creepy, crawly, and crawls on the earth that I did not permit, you shall not eat. It shall be impure for you. It will make you impure. You will not sense holiness. You will not know from holiness if you make these choices. Verse 45 comes along and adds a different dimension as to the why behind keeping kosher. And here we sense and we see and we learn that part of making the dietary choices we are asked to make is a matter of steering into our history. Every time we choose to eat kosher, we choose to recognize a God who saved us from Egypt, who took us out of Egypt, who lifted us up and elevated us spiritually, who lifted us up physically out of Egypt. And I emphasize that because that's the verb that is used here and only here to describe God's bringing us out of Egypt. We might think that it says who brought us out of Egypt or who took us out of Egypt, but Rashi will point out that here in our verse 45, Ki ani Hashem ha'ma'aleh etchem, it's written that God is ma'aleh etchem, that God lifts you up. B'chulan kativ hotzeti. So many times the Torah comes to teach that God took us out of Egypt. Hotzeti. God will say, I took you out of Egypt. V'chan kativ hama'aleh. But here in chapter 11 of Leviticus, it says, God elevates us, lifted us up out of Egypt. Quoting the Gemara, Rashi goes forward. And here we mention again that part of Rashi's project is to introduce and reintroduce Jewish people in his diaspora lands to the literature of Chazal, to the literature of the sages, the rabbis. And he says, Tana Devei Rabbi Yishmael, it was taught in the house of Rabbi Yishmael, had I not brought Israel out of Egypt, if I wanted them only to keep themselves pure through refraining from eating creeping things, kashar almot, like the other nations eat, dayam, it would have been sufficient for them to be redeemed. Hotzeti, I took them out, but I wanted to elevate them. I wanted to lift them up in a different way. Here, the language of hama'aleh etchem, of I elevated you and I lifted you out of Egypt, that comes to teach what? That it's an elevation for them to engage in this systematic way of eating and keeping kosher. V'zeu lashon male. That's the nature of including this verb, of using the root ayin lamed hey, so I could create a spiritual aliyah for the Jewish people, no matter where they are. Every individual makes a choice about what he or she eats. I want to connect them to their unique story, their history, the fact that I elevated and lifted them out of Egypt, them and their ancestors, and with our covenantal relationship, dor lador, generation to generation, this is the way that I provide for them opportunity to recognize that kind of powerful history every day in their lives, at every meal. And of course, God wants us to do so through our own choosing. Thusly, back to verse 44, the hit kadishtem, hit pa'el verb. You shall really choose this yourself. And hopefully this will gain you so much meaning in your life. It will elevate you. And then, Vehiyitem Kedoshim, you will be holy. From the get-go, one might not feel or sense that making the choice about keeping kosher is a level of holiness. It's really through the practice, the discipline, and the engagement of eating what's kosher and connecting it to this moment in history where we're in the wilderness and God says, I want to elevate you. So I want you to create for yourselves this unique culture, this unique system of eating, this unique engagement with my creatures that I grant you for nourishment. And making those personal choices about mitzvot are essential and woven into the fabric of Torah, here about kashrut, and for every mitzvah that God explains that we should do. Shabbat Shalom and good learning with you.